This is case IT 0992T, the prosecutor versus Ratko Mladić.
Thank you, Madam Registrar. Since the composition of the teams is not exactly the same as yesterday, Mr. McCloskey, could you give us the appearances for the prosecution?
Yes. Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, Your Honors, everyone. Today with me is Dermot Groom, Kweku Vanderpuye, Camille Bibles, and Janet Stewart.
Thank you. Mr. Lukic, appearances for the defense the same as yesterday.
Good morning, Your Honors. Good morning, everybody. Branko Lukic for the defense, joined by Mr. Miodrag Stojanovic, Miloš Šaljić, and Radovan Đurđević.
Thank you. And Mr. Mladić is present as well. Mr. McCloskey, you're the one who will continue the opening statement. If you're ready, you may proceed.
Thank you. The expulsion and murder of the non-Serb population of Bosnia, described to you yesterday by Mr. Groom, did not stop in 1993 or 1994. In a period of only 5 days, from the 12th through the 16th of July, 1995, the armed forces of Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladić expelled the civilian population of Srebrenica and murdered over 7,000 Srebrenica men and boys. The murders continued well beyond 16 July. From 17 July through the autumn of 1995, the VRS continued to capture and kill Srebrenica Muslim men as the victims tried in vain to find their way through the woods of eastern Bosnia. By November 1st, the VRS had eliminated the Muslim population of Srebrenica from eastern Bosnia, with the women, children, elderly men barely existing in refugee camps, left crippled, almost beyond hope, without their fathers, brothers, husbands, sons, and grandfathers. This was and will remain genocide. As you absorb the evidence of this crime, I have no doubt you will reach the same conclusion. Today, May 17th, 2012, after some 17 years of investigation, the evidence of this crime is overwhelming and unassailable. In brief, of the over 7,000 men and boys murdered, 5,977 have been exhumed from Srebrenica-related mass graves. Most of those victims have been identified by DNA. We have 11 amazing men who somehow were able to survive mass executions and crawl out from the carnage and find their way to safety. With their help and the benefit of aerial imagery, we have found the vast majority of Srebrenica mass graves and have exhumed them. We have searched the VRS commands and found vehicle logs and excavation records showing the date, place, vehicle, and operator working at many of those mass graves. We have operators of those machines who dug the mass graves and buried the victims. We have some of the soldiers who actually executed the victims, along with officers supervising those executions, as well as documents and records accounting for the Muslim prisoners and their fate. We have radio intercepts of VRS soldiers and officers discussing murders. We have video of 2, the actual executions themselves. So let me be perfectly clear. The crime will not be the main focus of this prosecution. This case will be primarily about one issue: the individual criminal responsibility of Ratko Mladić. But of course, Mladić did not commit these crimes alone. In July 1995, Mladić relied on a few key main staff officers to provide him with the advice, expertise, and leadership needed to design and implement the Srebrenica expulsion and genocide. To get the job done, Mladić relied upon Generals Tolimir, Gvero, and Miletić. There were other generals in his main staff, but these three were present, involved, and close confidants of Mladić. They all knew the horrors of forcing a people to leave and murder, yet they all did their part to this end. In 1995, General Mladić and his main staff looked to Generals Jivanović and Krstić, commander and deputy commander of the Drina Corps, to expel and murder Srebrenica Muslims. In turn, the main staff and General Krstić relied upon Drina Corps brigade commanders, Colonel Pandurović, Major Obrenović of the Zvornik Brigade, Colonel Blagojević of the Bratunac Brigade, and Special Police Deputy Commander Borovchinin and other commanders to defeat the Muslim forces, remove the Muslim population, and murder the able-bodied men of Srebrenica. Major Obrenović has pled guilty in this court. The 10th Sabotage Detachment of the main staff executed over 1,000 victims. 10th Sabotage soldier Dražan Erdemović has pled guilty to his involvement in these crimes and will testify here. The majority of the work in supervising, organizing, and implementing the actual removal of the Muslim population from Srebrenica and the murder of the able-bodied men fell to the security officers. Leading and supervising the VRS security organs in this process was General Zdravko Tolimir and his direct subordinates, Colonel Lubo Beara and Lieutenant Colonel Radoslav Janković. For the command of the Drina Corps, it was Lieutenant Colonel Vojvodin Popović. For the command of the Bratunac Brigade, Captain Momir Nikolić. For the command of the Zvornik Brigade, Lieutenant Drago Nikolić and Captain Milorad Turbic. Momir Nikolić has pled guilty to these crimes and will soon testify in this case. These were the men and forces who committed these crimes. In 1995, there were no paramilitaries, there were no civilian bands or outside forces involved, only VRS and one unit of mixed Ministry of Interior police forces known as MUP forces, and one MUP unit from Serbia working together with the VRS. These crimes are etched into the terrible history of the Bosnian War. The crimes have never been in serious dispute. We will therefore focus this case on the evidence linking General Mladić and his men to these crimes. Mladić was on the ground in command in Podachari, Bratunac, Sandici, and other places where these crimes were committed, from 11 July through the afternoon of 14 July. Mladić was on duty in command and control of the VRS while conducting state business during his time in Belgrade from the evening of 14 July through the evening of 16 July when he returned to Bosnia. This was not an army out of control or controlled by someone else. Only an army strictly controlled at the top could have managed to murder over 7,000 people in 4 days. The VRS was a professional army with a dynamic and disciplined chain of command. the VRS carried out their murderous orders with incredible discipline, organization, and military efficiency, capturing, detaining, transporting, murdering, and burying over 7,000 men and boys, at first in total secrecy from the outside world, was a truly amazing feat of utter brutality. Importantly, the survivors of the Srebrenica mass executions provide some of the most valuable evidence of the organization and efficiency of the murder operation, as we call it. Most of the survivors experienced the same thing. They were captured or surrendered in large numbers. They were relieved of their property. They were stored indoors or in vehicles. They were transported in huge convoys to some school or municipal building in and around Bratunac or Zvornik. They were transported in vehicles to nearby, mostly isolated execution sites, and summarily executed by firing squad, and buried by heavy engineering equipment the day of their death or a day or two after. So when listening to the evidence of survivors, it's important to appreciate what happened to the victims, of course, but also we need to look beyond the horror and focus on the underlying system of military efficiency evident from their testimony. The evidence proving Mladić was in command of the troops who committed these crimes is only part of the evidence proving Mladić's guilt. We will also prove that during the commission of some of these crimes, Mladić himself was on the ground and personally involved. The crucial linkage evidence will come largely from three sources. Documents. Most criminal orders in this war were given orally, and many of the important relevant documents have been destroyed or hidden. However, there are some crucial VRS and MOOP documents that survived and will help expose the crime and General Mladić's role in it. Intercepts. You will also see the text of radio intercepts taken down by the BH Army, known as the Muslim Army, as they eavesdropped on VRS conversation. We are confident that you will find this evidence reliable and credible. And of course, testimony. Many VRS witnesses involved in these crimes, or very close to them, will testify in this trial and provide important evidence implicating General Mladić. A word of caution here. Many of these VRS witnesses will not be telling you the complete truth, and may at times be less than truthful. In most cases, to avoid incriminating themselves or others. So with these witnesses, we will be requesting that they be provided a formal caution explaining their rights under ICTY law. When evaluating their evidence, it will be important to look to corroborating evidence in critically evaluating their testimony. But in the end, we believe you will find this evidence invaluable, as it gives you a look inside Mladić's very operation, and in most cases, you will be able to identify truth from untruth. The charges. This component involves two horrendous crimes. The forced movement of the Muslim population on 12 and 13, and the misery and death resulting from that, together with the mass murder of thousands of Bosnian Muslim men and boys, all amounting to the elimination of the Muslim population from Srebrenica and genocide. The forced movement. The forced movement on 12 and 13 July did not happen in a vacuum and involved much more than providing buses and trucks for the transportation. It included the following. 1. strangling the enclaves by limiting crucial supplies. 2, terrorizing the civilian population by sniping and shelling. 3, attacking the civilian population during the assault on the enclaves. And 4, finally, making sure the people were put on buses and forced out. Committing mass murder in this case involved all of the following in equal measure: capturing thousands of Muslim men who fled Srebrenica when it fell, transporting the victims to detention sites, detaining the victims in pre-execution detention sites, transporting the victims to execution sites, executing the victims, and disposing and burying of the bodies. In order to understand Srebrenica and identify Mladić's role in it, I will provide you with a chronology of the events and discuss briefly some of the most important evidence implicating Mladić himself. It's important to understand some of the specific historical background of the Srebrenica area, known by many names: the Drina Valley, the Podrinje, and the Birač region. As outlined to you by Mr. Groom, the war broke out in earnest in eastern Bosnia, beginning in the north in Bijeljina and working its way south to Zvornik and Bratunac, with the terrorizing murder, expulsion of the Muslim population. In November of 1992, Karadzic and Mladić set out their criminal plan for eastern Bosnia. In Directive 4, Mr. Groom has previously shown that to you. I will not do that again. But I do want you to see, and will go over, the Drina Corps adaptation of Directive 4. It was the duty of the Drina Corps to follow Directive 4, and they did so. On 24 November 1992, General Zhivanovic sent out to all of his brigades these words upon which to base their combat plans and operations to let go. And please, let's go with the document. In pertinent part, launch an attack using the main body of troops and major equipment to inflict on the enemy the highest possible losses, exhaust them, break them up, or force them to surrender, and force the Muslim local population to abandon the area of Serska, Žepa, Srebrenica, and Gorazda. An order for ethnic cleansing in Srebrenica in black and white. BRS attacks on the Muslim civilian population in the areas noted in this order were set out in UN reports and actually experienced by many of the Muslim witnesses in this case. In the early spring of 1993, the Muslims fled from this onslaught and crowded into the Srebrenica area, creating a massive humanitarian disaster, some of which was caught on video, where we will see General Morion stepping up on a vehicle to address the crowd. If we could play that video. Shortly thereafter, the United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 819, creating the safe area. In pertinent part, let's see the following on slide 3. condemns and rejects the deliberate actions of the Bosnian Serb Party to force the evacuation of the civilian population from Srebrenica and its surrounding areas as part of its overall abhorrent campaign of ethnic cleansing. The UN, acting with the best intentions, unfortunately created a ticking time bomb because they sent too few troops to Srebrenica to protect the Muslim population or disarm the BiH army, with the UN unable to fully protect the Muslim population and with the enclave surrounded by a vastly superior VRS, the BiH army did not disarm. Through the rest of 1993 and 1994, an unstable and eventually untenable situation developed in the Srebrenica enclave, where the VRS sniped and shelled the enclave on the one hand, and the BiH forces inside the enclave ran operations outside the enclave, sometimes in search of food, but other times as part of an established BiH policy to attack villages and army positions to force the VRS to keep troops around the enclave to prevent VRS reinforcements from the Sarajevo front. In 1994, the Bosnian Serb leadership's desire to cleanse the enclave of Muslims did not go away, and it was only the meager UN presence that kept the VRS at bay. The first UN troops were Canadian, followed by an army contingent from the Netherlands, known as the Dutch Battalion, or Dutchbat. A force from the Ukraine was stationed in Žepa. You will recall the short video Mr. Groom showed you of General Mladić driving a Canadian supporter, Lesic, around the Žepa area on 15 August 1995. In this video, Mladić revealed to Mr. Lesic why the enclaves were still Muslim. I won't show you that again, but I want to quote to you and let you see Mladic's words. "You filmed this freely, you know. Let our Serbs see what we have done to them, how we took care of the Turks. In Podrinje, we thrashed the Turks. If the Americans and English, the Ukrainians and Canadians in Srebrenica, in the meantime it's the Dutch, would not protect them, they would have disappeared from this area long ago." This was on the 15th of August, 1994. In 1994, the VRS intentions towards Srebrenica and Žepa were clearly set out in an official report to his troops by the commander of the Bratanac Brigade shortly after he was visited by General Mladić. In pertinent part, we see we must attain our final goal, an entirely Serbian Podrinja. We must continue to arm, train, discipline, and prepare the RS Army for the execution of this crucial task, the expulsion of Muslims from the Srebrenica enclave. There will be no retreat when it comes to the Srebrenica enclave. We must advance. The enemy's life has to be made unbearable and their temporary stay in the enclave impossible, so that they leave the enclave en masse as soon as possible, realizing that they cannot survive there. Again, we see the deliberate statement to expel the entire Muslim population from Srebrenica. Words similar to these are repeated by the main staff and President Karadzic 8 months later in the now famous Directive 7. On the 8th of March, 1995, President Karadzic signed off on Directive 7, which had been drafted by the main staff and approved by Mladić. Like the other directives, Directive 7 provided instructions to each of the VRS Corps on the military objectives in the upcoming period, which required each corps to follow such direction. Under the heading of the Drina Corps, I want to show you 3 critical directions. Here's the first. By planned and well thought out combat operations, create an unbearable situation of total insecurity, with no hope of further survival or life for the inhabitants of Srebrenica and Žepa. Here, we have almost the same words spelled out by the commander of the Bratanac Brigade 8 months earlier. The clear focus on making survival or life impossible for the Muslim populations of Srebrenica and Žepa. The directive goes on to identify a tactic to make life unbearable in the enclaves. Through the planned and unobtrusively restricting issuing of permits, reduce and limit the logistics support of UNPROFOR to the enclaves, and to supply of material resources to the Muslim population, making them dependent on our goodwill, while at the same time avoiding condemnation by the international community and international public opinion. This insidious plan is put in place, and we actually see the results on the Dutch battalion and the civilian population. Mladić is in charge of this process, and you will see his initials on original convoy documents denying much of the needed supplies to the enclaves. Okay, the third key. In case the UNPROFOR forces leave Žepa and Srebrenica, the Drina Corps Command shall plan an operation named Jadar, with the task of breaking up and destroying the Muslim forces in these enclaves and definitively liberating the Drina Valley. This shows that while Karadzic and Mladić wanted to create horrible conditions for the Muslims in the enclave, with the writing of this directive, they did not intend to take over the enclaves due to the presence of the UN forces there. As you will see, their objective would soon change. I can take that off. The Drina Corps took this directive at its word, and General Jivanovic, on 20 March 1995, passed on to his brigades the exact language set out in Directive 7. And he said, by planned and well thought out combat operations, create an unbearable situation of total insecurity, with no hope of further survival or life for the inhabitants of Srebrenica and Žepa. And sure enough, soon after Directive 7, the Drina Corps began planning a combat operation against the Srebrenica enclave. It was named Krivaya 95 and dated 2 July with a planned start date of 6 July. But just before we get to the attack on Srebrenica, I would like you to see 2 maps to help you get acquainted with the important towns and features of the area. Here is a map showing the VRS Corps zones, and you can see where the Drina Corps fits in the Bosnian landscape, with the Drina River in light brown as the border between Bosnia and Serbia. Let's go to the next map. Here is a map of the Drina Corps that shows the borders of the various brigades, as well as the Srebrenica, Žepa, and Gorazda enclaves. You can see Srebrenica and Žepa are close together. This is important. Also, note on this map the black line on the upper left part of the map. This is the approximate area of the front line, roughly 50 kilometers as the crow flies, from the edge of the Srebrenica enclave. This will be the direction the Muslim army and men go to, as we'll see later. So, the attack against Srebrenica. One objective of Krivaja 95 was to attack the BIH forces and cut them off from the Žepa enclave and separate the two enclaves from supporting each other. Given that the BIH had been running raids against the Serbs outside both the Srebrenica and Žepa enclave, this objective to stop BIH army activity was a legitimate military objective. However, Krivaja 95 had another objective that was anything but legitimate. That was to attack Muslim civilians and UN observation posts, or OPs, in order to drive the Muslim population of the enclave into the small urban area of the enclave and create a humanitarian disaster like that of 1993. The UN OPs were small, elevated huts fortified by sandbags and manned by a few soldiers. The OPs were situated at the outer ring of the border of the enclave. Now I want to take you to the attack plan itself to show you how General Zivanovic expressed the objectives I've just mentioned. In pertinent part, to split apart the enclaves of Žepa and Srebrenica and to reduce them to their urban areas, to create conditions for the elimination of the enclaves. To split apart the enclaves of Žepa and Srebrenica was the legitimate military objective I spoke of, to stop the BIH forces in both enclaves from supporting each other and running attacks outside the enclaves. However, to reduce them to their urban areas meant attacking the edges of the enclave and taking ground toward the city center and pushing the borders to the actual urban area of Srebrenica. This would cause the roughly 40,000 inhabitants of the enclave to be crowded into a small, narrow town of about 1 kilometer by 2 kilometers. This would create a humanitarian disaster just like that of 1993 that we had a brief glimpse of in the video recently. Create conditions for the elimination of the enclave, the third objective. This does not mean take the entire enclave. As you will recall, taking the enclave was contemplated in Directive 7 only if UNPERFOR left. Now I want to go to a map graphic that should help illustrate how the crisis was planned to develop. In this map, we can see the border of the enclave in purple and the approximate locations of the OPs around the enclave, known by their letter designations in military terms. OPF was known as OP Foxtrot to the Dutch Bat forces. You can see the yellow box indicating the small urban area of Srebrenica. about 1 kilometer by 2 kilometers, and very narrow in the middle. The area within the purple circle of Srebrenica, roughly 25 kilometers across, is where thousands of people lived, well outside the urban area. With the VRS attack and deployment into the enclave, those people would be forced to move into the urban area, where there was a small Dutch bat compound. This is, of course, exactly what happened. Before I leave this map, note that Srebrenica is about 5 kilometers from Potocari on the main road, another 5 from Potocari to Bratanac, and then this important road from Bratanac past Glagova, Kravica, Sandici, Konjević Polje, Nova Kasava, and Milici. The red lines from Jaglici to Shushenjari is where the Muslim men left from, and we'll get to that a bit later. And before we get there, I want to show you one more map. This is an actual VRS combat map. This was developed with the written attack plan, showing Mladić's personal authorization of the plan, as we see from his signature in the left-hand corner. You can see on this slide the boundary of the enclave, handwritten in blue and red lines. The blue lines represent the VIH Army lines, and the red are the VRS lines. Not only did Mladić authorize this operation himself, he also noted and signed the completion of the takeover on 12 July by his signature with a rough cross over the enclave. This was Serbian, and it's now Serbian. You will recollect Mr. Groom's words on that point. So, on to the attack. The attack began on 6 July 1995, and on 7 July, a UN military observer report noted that the VRS offensive was steadily intensifying, concentrating more on civilian targets in Srebrenica town and Potocari, and noting that there were several civilian casualties. This would continue. From 7 July From 7 July through 9 July, the VRS overtook key Dutch Bat OPs and held several Dutch Bat soldiers hostage in Bratanac. The VRS continued to drive back and defeat the BIH forces, whose leader, Nasser Oric, had been transferred out of the enclave weeks earlier with some key commanders. By the evening of 9 July, the VRS was in a position to take the town of Srebrenica itself, as there had been no NATO bombing, and the Dutch Bat were totally outgunned and unable to stop them. So on the evening of 9 July, the plan changed from creating conditions for the elimination of the enclave to actually going into the heart of the enclave and taking it. This is set out in a communication from General Tolomir to General Krstić, who was commanding the attack. In pertinent part, the President of the Republic is satisfied with the results of the combat operations around Srebrenica and has agreed with the continuation of operations for the takeover of Srebrenica, disarming of Muslim terrorist gangs, and complete demilitarization of the enclave. The reference that the President has agreed with the continuation of operations for the takeover of Srebrenica means that Mladić has proposed to his supreme commander that the attack continue, and Karadzic has agreed and authorized the proposed action. This is how the chain of command works in the VRS. Mladić was fully aware of the VRS success in Srebrenica, as we can see from the following order he issued on 10 July. Mladić states, as a result of the newly arisen situation around the Srebrenica enclave and the VRS success in that part of the front, separation of the enclaves, and narrowing the area around Srebrenica, and in order to close the Žepa enclave and improve the tactical position of our forces around the enclave, the command of the Drina Corps shall plan and launch an offensive around the Žepa enclave. So at this time, Mladić is fully aware that the objectives of Krivaja 95 have almost been met, and he orders plans for attacking Žepa. Now, getting to the fall of the enclave. By the morning of 11 July, Dutch Bat had fallen back, the ABIH unit collapsed, and most of the able-bodied men of Srebrenica have moved to the northwest of the enclave to the villages of Jaglici and Šušenjari in an attempt to escape the wrath of the VRS. Many of the residents of Srebrenica had vivid memories of what had happened to their families and neighbors in 1992 and 1993 in places like Bratanac, as described to you earlier by Mr. Gloom. They were rightfully afraid for their lives. The women, children, and elderly men, along with some able-bodied men, gathered together a few belongings and found some way to get to the UN bases. One in Srebrenica, known as Bravo Company, and the main UN base in Potocari. Potocari was 5 kilometers north of Srebrenica. I want you to see a brief video of what it was like in downtown Srebrenica at Bravo Company on 11 July as the VRS approached the town from the south. These images are remarkably similar to the video we saw of Srebrenica in 1993. If you study both these videos, you will see that terror is palpable. The same thing was happening. Very few stayed behind in Srebrenica town. Most people walked the 5 kilometers to the Potocari base, or some were able to get on UN vehicles, as you can see from the video. On this day, the 11th of July, NATO planes finally arrived and dropped a few bombs near the advancing VRS troops, with little effect. By this time, it is too late. The VRS had become so close to the town and the remaining UN troops that any significant bombing was impossible. In addition, the VRS had taken several Dutch Bat soldiers hostages and threatened to kill them if NATO conducted any more airstrikes. So, by the afternoon of 11 July, Mladić and his forces entered Srebrenica town. They found it almost completely vacant. The women and children and elderly had gone to Potocari, and the army and the able-bodied men left through the woods to the Jaglici area to assemble and begin the long 50-kilometer trek through the woods towards Tuzla. Mladić himself entered the town with General Živanović, nicknamed Žile, and General Krstic, nicknamed Krle. And this is caught on film. For the purpose of this opening, I've taken a brief clip from the complete video. You will be shown the complete video at trial.
Jesi naš još napred? Još napred, dobro. Čiste glade, uzeti. Možete kao pri saucu mužno.
Dobro, znam ja da može neki ide on za mnom polako.
Ovo je kod nas trajno kad izmaknemo.
Ajde Žile, Krstiću. Ajde Krle. Snimimo na u zastavu. Bacite u zastavu dole da se ne vjori, pobodi je dole. Ovamo neke kamere vidi. Tako.
Ajde, idemo dalje.
Pravac bratunac. Ajde, momci. Pravac bratunac vojsko, jel čujete što govori? Ajmo. Kreći. Pravac potočari, hajde. U zahvatu puta silu.
Idemo bratunac, šef, idemo bratunac.
Ajde, pravac bratunac. Ajde, nema, tu su pobegli, čovječe. Bili smo mi na ovim listima. 1995. godine u srpskoj Srebrenici. Uoči još jednog velikoga praznika srpskoga, poklanjamo srpskome narodu ovaj grad i napokon došao je trenutak da se posle bune protiv Dahija Turcima osvetimo na ovom prostoru.
Mladić's comment about the rebellion against the Dahis is likely a reference to the 13 July 1804 uprising of Serbs against Turkish mercenaries known as Dahis. Over the next 5 days, after this ominous remark about revenge, Mladić's troops captured and systematically murdered thousands of Srebrenica men and boys. So by the evening of 11 July, about 15,000 able-bodied men, with some women and children, started off through the woods across the northern enclave boundary, trying to reach Tuzla area, and about 25,000 women and children and old men go to Potocari, seeking safety at the UN base there. First, I want to speak about the events in Potocari and Bratunac over the next 2 days. So by the evening of 11 July, the women and children and elderly, including, importantly, at least 1,000 able-bodied men, make it to Potocari, seeking safety at the Dutch battalion base there. That day, the Dutch Bat forces still controlled the Potocari area, and the VRS was waiting until the morning of the 12th before moving in to Potocari. On the evening of the 11th, there were 2 meetings at the Hotel Fontana in Bratunac. The first at 8 p.m. between Mladić and Colonel Karaman's, the commander of the Dutch forces. The second with Mladić, Karaman's, and a Muslim representative brought from the crowd by Dutchbat on the direction of General Mladić. Mladić dominated both these meetings in what were truly frightening encounters. There were no negotiations at these meetings, no give and take. Mladić was in total control. I want to show you a short segment of the first meeting to give you some of the flavor of Mladić's manner and control. You will see Mladić speaking directly to Colonel Karaman's, who is facing the camera.
Znači, vi ste naredili da vaši vojnici ubijaju vojnike i da avijacija NATO pakta, zahtevali ste da avijacija NATO pakta dejstvuje po mojim dopunama.
So you gave an order that your soldiers shoot my soldiers and that NATO aviation air force bound my troops in my positions.
No, not again. That's not decided by me. I'm not asking for. That's something what they offer. They make decisions on what I put on information from the bottom to, let's say, even to United Nations in New York.
Još jednom, ta odluka nije donesena. Tu odluku nisam donio ja, nego na osnovu informacije koje sam nadao, tu su odluku donio izvršenje stranice.
Nemojte vi mene da fantazirate, gospodine Potkončić, odgovorite na moje pitanje. Jeste vi naredili da vaša vojska puca po moje vojsci?
Don't do the fantasy here, Colonel, and just simply tell me, did you give an order that your soldiers shoot at my soldiers?
I gave the order to defend themselves.
Dao sam naređenje da se brane.
That's
Od koga su se branili kad ih niko nije napadao?
Who were they defending from when nobody was attacking them?
I have been attacked by mortars and by tanks.
Bio sam na odluku.
Vi ste, gospodine Potkonče, bili dužni da u skladu sa sporazumom od aprila i maja 1993. godine razoružate muslimane u Srebrenici.
You were due, according to the contracts, to disarm Muslims into Srebrenica.
A vi ste ih naoružavali, s njima švercovali i pripremali za borbu protiv Srba.
Gave weapons to them, smuggled with them, and prepared them for fighting against
I još ste izdali danas naređenje vašim trupama da tuku po mojim vojnicima.
Plus you gave the order today to your troops to shoot at my troops.
Da čujem šta želite.
After the yelling stopped, Mladić continued to berate the Dutch bad officers.
Mr. Mladić, do I understand that you would like to have a short break? I saw you gesturing. Yes. Then we'll have a short break of 5 minutes and then continue at 10 o'clock.
All rise, free full away. All rise, free full away. Please be seated.
Mr. McCloskey, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, we left off with General Mladić yelling at Colonel Karaman's. After the yelling stopped, Mladić continued to berate the Dutch bad officers and intimidate them by making references to life and death and asking Karaman's whether he wanted to see his children again. Mladić demanded that Karaman's find a Muslim representative and bring him back to the hotel that evening. Karaman's was able to find a local school teacher, Nezib Manjic, willing to fulfill the role as Muslim representative. I won't play you the video of the second meeting now, but I will show you a still of a then young Nezib Manjic. During this meeting, a pig was slaughtered right outside the window where they were seated. The screams of the animal going on and on, further intimidating the Dutch bat officers. At one point in the meeting, Mladić focused on Mr. Mladić and said, "In order to make a decision as a man and a commander, I need to have a clear position of the representatives of your people on whether you want to survive, stay, or vanish. I am prepared to receive here tomorrow at 10 a.m. hours a delegation of officials from the Muslim side with whom I can discuss the salvation of your people from the enclave." Mladić goes on to say, "Nezab, the future of your people is in your hands. Bring the people who can secure the surrender of weapons and save your people from destruction. Everything's in your hands. And bring some prominent people from around here." Here we can see that Mladić is obsessed with the salvation and destruction of the Muslim people. And this is not idle chatter for the camera, as it was this very evening made their first decisions on the plan to murder the Muslim men and boys. As I mentioned, at least 1,000 able-bodied Muslim men went with their families to Potocari on the 11th. On the early evening of 11 July, the VRS were able to look down from their positions above Potocari and see many hundreds of able-bodied men among the crowd of people in Potocari. Momir Nikolić had this information and reported it up the chain. Generals Mladić and Krstić and other senior officers were together at the Hotel Fontana and decided that when they marched into Potocari and took control of the people the next morning, 12 July, they would separate all the men and boys aged 16 to 60 and hold them in Bratunats to be executed. Mladić did hold a third meeting at the Hotel Fontana at 10 a.m. on the 12th. And his murder plan began to reveal itself at that meeting. I won't show you that video now, but I do want to show you a still photo from the front of the Hotel Fontana right before that meeting. On the far left of our left, we see Momir Nikolić. Next to him, Radislav Jankovic. Keep going to the right, we see a security guard for Mladić. And on the far left, the far right of our screen is Vujadin Popović. At the 10 a.m. meeting, Mladić told the Dutch BAT officers and additional Muslim representative roughly the same thing he had said to Mr. Mladić the night before, stating, and I quote, "As I told the gentleman last night, you can either survive or disappear. For your survival, I demand that all your armed men, even those who committed crimes, and many did, against our people, surrender their weapons to the VRS." You will actually see him say this on the video during trial. Mladić also, and this is the crucial part, told the group at the third meeting that he would be screening all men between the ages of 16 and 60 to determine if they were war criminals. This statement was cut out of the video we have received, but the Dutch BAT officers clearly remembered it and will testify about Mladić saying it. From this statement, it's clear that Mladić and his top officers had considered what to do with the able-bodied men and boys of Srebrenica well prior to the morning meeting, and by the morning of 12 July had decided to separate them from their families, as Mladić stated. But that is not all they decided. After the meeting was over, Lieutenant Colonel Popovich met briefly with Momir Nikolic outside the hotel and told Nikolic that the able-bodied men in Podachari would be separated from their families and killed. And Popovich asked Nikolic to provide locations in the immediate area that would be well suited for executions. Nikolic will testify to this and tell you that he told Popovich that the old Sase mine would be a good place for the job, as well as the local brick factory. By the early afternoon of 12 July, VRS and MUP forces had moved on Podachari and taken over complete control of the area, including the masses of Muslim civilians. Shortly after the takeover of Podachari, buses and trucks arrived from all over Bosnia, and the VRS and MUP began the process of putting the women and children on buses to Muslim-controlled territory and separating and holding the Muslim men and boys for execution. Importantly, there was little or no screening of men and boys. Their IDs and belongings were taken and discarded. There was no listing of names or any significant effort to identify anyone. The men were given no food, no medical care, very little water, and crowded into buildings in the searing 40-degree heat in horrendous conditions, where many were beaten and some were murdered. You will hear from a local official who had to pick up well over 50 bodies distributed inside and outside the building in Bratunac, where the men were held. With no records made or basic procedures followed, along with the terrible treatment, this could only mean that on 12 July, Mladić had no intention to allow these men to survive. Mladić was present in Podachari and Bratunac on 12 and 13 July, while the separation, detention, and murder was occurring. His men were in charge of the process, including Colonel Beata and Lieutenant Colonel Jankovic. Over the 12th and 13th of July, the VRS and MUP forces expelled to Muslim-controlled territory roughly 25,000 women, children, and elderly men, and kept over 1,000 Muslim men and boys in Bratunac, including boys 15 years and younger, and men over 65 to 70 years of age. I will now show you a very brief look at some of what was happening in Podachari on the 12th and 13th July. You will see terrified people and lines of separated men. Many we now know were murdered. And this is only a fraction of what really went on there. We can never truly understand the horror. We could play that short video. On that last clip, you finally saw at the end only men who had been separated and sent on that one side of the line of buses. Mladić was in Podachari speaking to the people on camera and arranging transportation. In one Drinacor order of 12 July, General Zivanovic references an order by Mladić to obtain 50 buses. So Mladić, while acting for the cameras, was also working and commanding his forces in Podachari. On the early afternoon of 12 July, Mladić was intercepted speaking over the radio in a text I would like you to see. X says, "Go ahead, General." Mladić, "Have these buses and trucks left?" X, "They have." Mladić, "When?" X, 10 minutes ago. Mladić, "Good, excellent. Continue to monitor the situation. Don't let small groups of them sneak in. They've all capitulated and surrendered and will evacuate them all. Those who want to and those who don't want to." The Muslims had no choice whatsoever. They were all being expelled by Mladić. On the evening of 12 July, Mladić held a dinner with the brigade commanders, celebrating their Srebrenica success. At that dinner, Mladić issued orders that the brigade commanders prepare their troops to march to Žepa the next day and begin immediate preparations to attack the Žepa enclave. Now, let me take you back to the roughly 15,000 Muslim men who left the enclave on the evening of 11 July and tried to make their way across Serb territory to the Muslim-controlled territory near Tuzla. Of this number, probably 1/3 of the men were armed, and they were mostly at the front of the column, leading the way. We believe about half those men made it out of the enclave and across the asphalt Bratunac-Konjević-Polje-Milici road on the 12th of July, before the Serb forces had a chance to fortify the road with men and armored vehicles. That was the road I briefly mentioned to you earlier on the map graphic. Those roughly 7,000 men eventually made it to the area of Nezuk, where after many hours of intense fighting with forces of the Zvornik Brigade, a corridor was opened and passage was allowed for many thousands of Srebrenica Muslim. This happened on 16 July, after the Serbs suffered at least 40 dead. I would like to show you now a map graphic of the route of the column. If we could start with the cursor at Jaglici and show you the path of the column up towards Nova Kasaba and Konjević-Polje and Srpska, across the Drinacha River and on towards Hadžići and the town of Nezuk, which was in Muslim-controlled territory. The purple line between Nezuk and Hadžići represented the confrontation line and is the place where fierce fighting broke out on the 15th and 16th of July between the Muslim column and the VRS forces, as well as the Muslim Second Corps from the direction of Tuzla. Now, getting back to the 12th of July and to the Muslims that did not make it over the asphalt road. These people became trapped behind the wall of the Serb forces, lined up along the road between Kravica, Konjević-Polje, and Nova Kasaba. Like the men and boys in Podachari, they were marked for death and would soon all be summarily executed. By the late afternoon of 12 July, the RS Special Police, acting under Mladić's orders, had manned this road and trapped up to 6,000 people from the column who had not made it across the road. On the morning of 13 July, many of the trapped men were captured along the road or turned themselves in. The organized mass executions started on the morning of 13 July, when 15 Muslim prisoners were taken by bus from a few kilometers from where they were captured along the road and summarily executed by a firing squad along the banks of the Yadar River. One man survived, and you will have his testimony. During the day of the 13th, roughly 5,000 to 6,000 Muslim men were captured and held in large groups in 3 open fields near the villages of Sandici, Konjević Polje, and Nova Kasaba. I will now show you a short video clip of some of the Muslim men captured in the area of Sandici, a short distance from a large warehouse near the village of Kravica.
Kod koga, kaži? Kod Rame! A jevo te Ramo, kaži kod Srba. Kod Srba! Tako, kaži kod Srba. Termine! Ajde dolam, ja sam dolam, slobodno kod Srba! Svi ajte!
You just saw Ramo Osmanović calling for his son Nirman to come out of the woods, being forced to do so by the MUP soldier. Ramo and his son Nirman were both murdered by Mladić's forces and were buried in mass graves. Their remains have been recovered and identified. The organized executions continued on the late afternoon of the 13th with the murder of about 1,000 Muslims held at a warehouse next to the village of Kravica. The same person who filmed Ramo filmed part of the executions at the Kravica warehouse. I will now show you that film with a slow-motion segment added by us for clarity. The cameraman is in a car driving past the Kravica warehouse. You will be seeing bodies piled up in front of the warehouse, and witnesses will confirm that. You will also hear gunfire.
Mrtvih muslimanskih vojnika
By the early evening of 13 July, with well over 1,000 Muslims held in Bratunac's town itself, and as many as 5,000 held along the asphalt road, the plan changed, and it was decided by Mladić and Karadzic to move the remaining prisoners to the Zvornik area to be murdered. outside of UNPROFOR and all the NGOs stationed in and around Potocari and Bratunac. You will see an intercept from the evening of 13 July between Karadzic and his Bratunac party chief, Miroslav Deranic, discussing the movement of prisoners to warehouses away from Bratunac, and Momir Nikolic will provide you the details of the plan. On the late afternoon of 13 July, Mladić finally began making his way from Bratunac back to his command post at Crna Rijeka. He traveled along the road past Kravica, Sandici, Gornjević Polje, and Nova Kasava, where the Muslim men were still held in large, clustered groups along the road. Mladić stopped and spoke to these groups, promising them they would be exchanged. Shortly after speaking to the Muslims on the Sandici meadow, some of whom you saw in that footage, several hundred prisoners were taken to the nearby Kravica warehouse and murdered. While Mladić was with a crowd of prisoners in Nova Kasava, a Muslim man in the crowd was shot and killed in Mladić's presence. The military police at Nova Kasava were actually making lists of Muslim prisoners that day. However, when Mladić arrived to speak to that group, he ordered the MPs to stop making lists, an obvious indication that there would be no exchange. Like the others along the road, all the men at Nova Kasava were soon transported to Bratunac, spent the night, and then on to Zvornik on the 14th, where they were all murdered.
Mr. McCloskey, could you find a suitable moment within the next 2 or 3 minutes so that we can have a break?
This is a good time, Mr. President.
Then we take a break and we resume at 11 o'clock.
All rise, free full away.